This grid system is buried underneath my lawn, and that means that this lawn can take over 80,000 pounds. If you want to learn how we installed it, along with why we installed it, keep on watching. Let's get started.
This side grass yard has been through a lot over the years, mainly because I do so many projects in my backyard, which is why it's time to rejuvenate this entire space with a very structurally sound yard. If you've watched some of my videos in the past, you may remember a driveway that I did a couple years ago where I used a grid system with a gravel base, along with filling that grid system with crushed rock. With this entire system installed properly, it has a load rating of over 88,000 pounds. And that's really nice, especially if you have large equipment that's being parked and you don't want any of that gravel to move over time. This is one of my most popular projects of all time on YouTube, but a lot of people were asking, can you do anything else other than a gravel system? Well, I contacted Vodaland and they said, yes, you can do a grass installation as well, which is why I made the executive decision of testing this product out on my own yard.
Now, this grass might look, normal and nice, but when you get close to it, it is really rough. And I actually want to use this space for some trailer usage and so forth. And I want to make sure that we have the strongest grass area and driveway area that we could possibly ask for. So in order to make it quick and efficient, we brought in the skid steer Bobcat. Now I've used this product on my backyard. This is another version, but still going to be the same emphasis of using this rock bucket to make sure we sift as much of the soil out of this as possible and are only getting rid of the grass itself and more of the sod versus the soil. We want to keep as much of the soil as possible, but we'll also need to dig out quite a bit of the soil because we want to get below grade in order to pour some rock along with then including our grid system. So first things first, let's get this sod out of here.
As you can see here, it is extremely beneficial if you're able to get a skid steer like this with a rock bucket. And a rock bucket is mainly used for large rocks, which you will see later on in the video, but certainly in this application it works quite well with sod, especially considering that I'm sifting out as much of the soil as possible so I can purchase less soil in the long run, along with the fact that I don't have a large dumping fee, or at least as minimal as possible. And through the process of removing the grass, I found this cool toy car. Now it somewhat looks like one of those Ford GT40s from the movie Ford vs Ferrari, but I certainly don't know off the top of my head. But maybe I need to send this off to one of those YouTube content creators that specializes in restoration, so if you have any in mind, let me know in the comment section. Here's where the rocks actually come into play for the rock bucket. I did have this old retaining wall that I personally liked the aesthetics of, but it really didn't do a very good job to support the yard on this side. I'm going to be replacing this entire retaining wall with a more substantial, more modern looking retaining wall, but I'm going to do that in a separate video because as the audience, you came here for a driveway makeover, not a retaining wall video. As I rip out the remaining grass in this yard, you may be wondering, where is all of this grass going? Well, number one, don't put this in your yard debris because I did have to learn that the hard way. Secondly, you could rent a dumpster, but a dumpster would be more costly than the route that I took. The route that I took was picking up a 3-yard dump truck that has a hydraulic lift to it, so I'm easily able to put it into the back of this truck, and once completely filled to the brim, I can take an hour of my day, drive it to the dump, and press a button for it to be completely removed from said back of truck. Extremely satisfying and a huge time saver, especially when considering that this only cost me about $100 to dump this load. On my way back home, I also picked up some 5/8 crushed rock, which will be the base for our grid system eventually. More on that later, but for now, I need to get back home so I can start removing some of the soil off of our driveway. We need to make room for at least 2 inches of crushed rock, plus another 2 inches for our Vodaland grid system. That means we have to dig up a substantial amount of soil off of the top of this driveway. Luckily for me, I still have my skid steer loader and I have a secondary bucket, so I'm able to scoop this amount of soil quite easily and place it in the middle of my driveway. Keep in mind that I'm not too concerned with the overall levelness of this driveway. I'm just trying to make sure it's as smooth as possible, and that's particularly important to keep in mind since the elevation of the street in comparison to the elevation of my backyard is at least a foot difference. I personally was surprised by how large the amount of soil that was placed in my asphalt driveway became, but after considering the amount of soil that I took out, we're looking at least 6 to 8 yards of soil, which does have to go somewhere eventually, so I need to keep that in mind. The most important area to be mindful of during this process is the transition between your soil and the street.
So this edge is quite important because we need approximately 4 inches from this base to the asphalt, because we have 2 inches of crushed rock, then we have the grid system, which is going to be another 2 inches. So that's where we want it. We are there, hopefully there around the vast majority of this edge, which I do believe so. We are. So now it's time to just level this out and get some crushed rock on it.
The existing soil certainly is not perfect, but it is close to where I want it. But I do go over the entire area with a lawn leveling rake. This basically just cuts down those small high spots and smooths them out in a simplistic fashion. With that taken care of, it's now time for a weed barrier, and this is a permeable weed barrier, so it's more of a woven fabric that's extremely durable, and I place this anywhere I expect our crushed rock to be placed. Just be mindful of a potential wind gust because this can get a little unwieldy. In order to make sure that this weed barrier stays put, I hammered down a few stakes in the corners along with every 4 to 6 feet along the way. If you're in an area where you don't have any wind and it just stays put, you certainly don't need to apply stakes because once the crushed rock is on top, this thing is not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. Once you apply a first layer, you are going to be applying a second layer most likely adjacent to it, and you do want a bit of an overlap. I do about 4 inches of overlap, and that's plenty for a barrier such as this. With our weed barrier fully applied, we can make our way back to our dump truck, which has our 5/8 crushed minus rock. I scooped the first couple loads with our skid steer, but that certainly doesn't last very long because the skid steer can only reach so far. Our crushed rock is placed right on top of our weed barrier, and just know that we're not super accurate with trying to get exactly 2 inches thick. We're trying to be mindful of spreading out evenly, but the more important thing or more important factor is to use a bulk calculator, because if you calculate the distance that you have as far as square footage goes in comparison to the overall thickness that you want, I came out with approximately 4 yards of crushed rock, which is exactly what we used in this circumstance. Another great opportunity to take advantage of the hydraulic lifting capabilities of this truck came into play when I got to dumping out our crushed rock. Now, if I did this again, I probably wouldn't have used the skid steer to smooth it out because it was a bit bumpy on the skid steer since we're going over a large mound of crushed rock. In hindsight, I probably should have just backed up our dump truck and tried to slowly go over the area while simultaneously pouring out our crushed rock at least as evenly as possible. Would have made it a little bit easier in the long run, but we live and learn, and so I'll try it out next time. From past experience, I've flattened out a number of different types of yards, but personally, my favorite tool to make sure it is as flat as possible is a DIY leveling rake, or whatever you want to call this. It can be made up of 4x4s or even 2x6s like I've done here, but it's just a nice easy way to go over large surfaces, and keyword on large surfaces like a lawn in this circumstance, and it's because it cuts down the high spots and fills in the low spots at the same time, which is extremely beneficial in a project like this. Once I'm done with my large DIY leveling mechanism, I do go back around and just tidy up some areas with my lawn leveling rake, and once that's accounted for and I'm in a happy position, we can move on to compacting.
Now that we have our crushed rock all the way down and smoothed out, not level, just smooth, we're gonna go over with a plate compactor, and this is gonna solidify all this crushed rock to make sure that we have a nice compacted surface for our grid system to go on top of. Just solidifies everything in place, makes it very sturdy, and it's always good to start from the ground up on a quality surface. So let's get this bad boy started and compacted.
If you've used a plate compactor, you probably know how satisfying they are to work with because it really does do a masterful job at compacting that crushed rock. And that's exactly why it's so important to use the proper rock for your substrate so it can compact properly. As I mentioned before, this is 5/8 crushed minus, which means that there is a lot of small particles that are in the base material that accounts for how it compacts so quickly and easily. Now you can use 5/8 or even 3/4 clean aggregate gravel and still compact it, which does lead to even better drainage, but I've used the same exact mixture on a number of different types of yard projects, including my turf yard just adjacent to this one with zero drainage issues whatsoever, and I do live in the Pacific Northwest. And as a general side note, your local large bulk material yard might not be calling it 5/8 crushed minus. They might have another term for it or another completely different type of product that still serves the same functionality. For more common practices, you can tell a bulk yard that you're looking for a material that you would place underneath a concrete slab that would be compacted prior to pouring. That's generally going to be the same exact use case for this type of material. I compact the entire yard in a clockwise position and then go the opposite direction and compact it once more to make sure I have 2 full passes over this entire yard. Once that's complete, it's time for another layer of weed barrier.
Now we could basically just put our grid system right on top of this crushed rock, but because we're putting soil into our grid system, I wanted to guarantee and make sure that we didn't gum up the works in terms of our crushed rock, making sure that this solidified and stayed a quality base for as long as possible. So in order to do that, we're putting in another layer of weed barrier over the top of it, and then we're gonna put our grid system down from there. Probably a little extra work, but I'd say it's much worth it if we put this much time and energy into this one already.
I will acknowledge that Vodaland doesn't indicate that this is needed in their installation instructions, but I personally do think that it's just a nice, good practice to have to make sure that rock base doesn't get gummed up over the years.
We're finally to the point where we're going to be putting our grid system down. Now this is Vodaland. Pretty slick little system. We're going to put down this grid system first, make sure it's all looking good, and then we'll get to some soil. But really nice system that you can really evenly distribute the weight of a trailer or a large vehicle on it, which hopefully will just make sure that we don't degrade this area over time.
Vodaland has a number of different types of products and materials to use in different types of applications, but on this project, this is their EasyPave Gravel and Grass Driveway Grid System. This is made up of 100% recycled PPE plastic and is extremely easy to click together. In order to click together, all you have to do is configure the alignment correctly and make sure that those clips are in the right position so they click into each other. Very simple and straightforward, just know that this is obviously done numerous times, so even with this being a simple process, it still took me hours to install. Now please know that Vodaland is the sponsor of this week's video, but it's really nice because of the fact that I personally used their product for the first time a couple years ago, and I saw firsthand how nice it was to use, along with how happy the end-all customer was with the product over the last few years. Now, years later, we're able to team up on my very own project, and I'm happy to have them as a sponsor. So if you are interested in this product or any of their other amazing products to choose from, make sure you check out the link in the description box below. As I mentioned previously, the main objective when installing this product is to make sure that we have even weight distribution when we're going over this space with large loads. And I do plan on having a trailer on this area eventually. And the beautiful thing about this structure is that it's all supporting one another, which is why it can hold over 80,000 pounds of load weight on this grid without breaking. And the entire system as far as installation is quite straightforward. The only unique caveat to that is that you want to build out your rows before you connect your rows together, and it makes it much easier in terms of installation. I didn't realize this until I started installing the grid system for the first time on my gravel driveway that I did a couple years ago, but it really does make a huge difference in terms of the ease of installation. With my rows fully assembled, I take a stake and a string line, stake it in place, and that way I have a perfectly straight line to follow as I'm assembling my grid systems together. There's definitely some wiggle room in the system, so making sure that you have a very straight string line to follow makes quick work of trying to navigate proper alignment. At this point, the installation is quite fluid and comes together very quickly now that we have everything lined up appropriately. However, that all changes when we get to the front lip of our driveway because of our driveway being curved at the very tip of it. Because it's curved, we have to cut some of our panels to fit in properly. In order to do so, I just grab my multi-tool, which makes quick work of cutting small little notches in order to fit each section of Vodaland tight up against our asphalt. The front lip of any driveway is going to be more prone to damage over time because it's going to see the most action. If anything is going to be driving past here and through here, it's going to hit this lip. So to make sure that we have as strong of a lip as possible, you want this grid system as close to the lip as possible. As we finish off the installation of our grid system, please know that you can also stake the system into place, but personally, I don't find the need of having too many stakes in the system like this because we're going to have thousands of pounds of soil on top of it, and that's going to hold it in place. However, in areas where you have a slight slope to it, it is good to have a few stakes in those locations because those areas are going to be more prone to sliding and slipping over time. With our grid system fully installed, it's now time to bury it. Yep, we're never going to see this again, hopefully. The raw soil I have laying in the driveway is going right into our grid system, and that is with imperfections and all, because the grid system is basically acting as a filtration unit while I'm raking over the top of it. I'm able to rake out large rocks or even grass along the way that was in the large dirt pile in my asphalt driveway. If there's a bit too much rock in some of the holes in our grid, that's okay because I'm going to be also placing a bit of dirt on top of this layer, which I'll be sifting through in order to avoid any of the large rocks right on top of our soil for our seed to be applied to. In areas of the yard where I don't have any Vodaland grid system installed, I obviously have a couple of inches to work out. In terms of transition, where the Vodaland grid system is a little bit higher in comparison to the dirt adjacent to it. That's simple enough where I'm just filling up that space and I'll be compacting it with a lawn roller eventually. Our Vodaland grid system might be fully filled, however, we still have soil to go through. And in order to make sure that we have some quality topsoil, I'm going to be using a sifting mechanism with the leveling device that I used earlier that just sifts out the majority of those loose grass particles along with the larger rocks, which we certainly don't want in this top layer of soil. At this point in time, I'm just using a wheelbarrow and my trusty rake to smooth out the majority of this soil. And I'm just trying to get to a point where I'm not seeing any of the Vodaland system that's visible. It's okay if we see it later, but it just gives me a nice way to determine what areas are covered properly versus what areas aren't, and I'll do that all the way down our lawn area. We certainly had plenty of soil to work with, which I'd say was about a yard or two to sift through, but the problem is that sifting process does take quite a bit of time. So this took hours to do, just even if it was a small amount, because we're sifting every single shovelful. At a certain point, I did bring over my leveling screed just to try and fill in those low spots and take down those high spots. And luckily for me, my daughter also wanted to pitch in. And if my daughter wants to actually help me in the yard or any other project, I have to say yes. We eventually sifted through the remaining dirt in my driveway, and once that entire yard area was taken care of, it's time to grow some grass. But before we get to the grass itself, we need to prep the soil, and for that we're going to be applying a few different things. First off, we're applying a lime that can be beneficial to lawns when soil pH is too acidic, which can hinder the grass from incorporating nutrients. I poured it into my fertilizer spreader because this normally does work. However, this bag of lime I've had sitting in my garage for a couple of years, and it's just extremely clumpy in comparison to what it was originally. But we're still able to broadcast it over the entire yard so we can make our way to fertilizer. For fertilizer, we're just using a generic organic fertilizer, and I want to make sure that the sub base here still has plenty of nutrients because there's not a lot of soil due to the fact that we have the crushed rock below this. With our fertilizer broadcasts, we can make our way to adding some compost to the mix. Now this is a quality compost I picked up at my local bulk material yard. And I'm really just trying to apply a good inch of topsoil to the mix so we have a truly enriched soil for our seed to bind to. Once I have a decent amount of the yard covered, I grab my leveling rake and start making sure that it's as even as possible at this point. Just trying to take down those high spots and then level out those low spots. But now that we have that area taken care of, I can just back up my truck and do the same procedure over and over and over again. This yard area is approximately 1,000 square feet, so I did have to go back to my local bulk yard to pick up a second yard of compost, and that allowed me to finish off this yard, but also had plenty extra for a bit of top dressing. But before we get to that, we need to get to rolling. Yard rolling with a lawn roller. Now this thing is filled to the brim with water, so it is quite heavy. I'd say it's easily over 100 pounds, and we're just going over this area because we want a nice solid footprint for our seed to be broadcast onto. This basically just does a nice final job of solidifying all the topsoil before we get to seed. With our lawn fully rolled out, we can now finally make our way to seed. And for seed, I just went to my local garden nursery and asked them what's the hardiest seed that they have in stock. I certainly want this yard to look nice, but I also want it to be extremely durable because of the fact that we're going to be driving on it occasionally, or often. The bag that I purchased originally did say it was for 1,000 square feet, but I was definitely short by the time I finished that first bag, so I went for a second one, and glad I did because I want to make sure that we don't have any bald spots across this lawn after we start getting the grass growing. With seed applied, you may be thinking that we're ready for water. However, in the past, the one thing that really helps grass germinate well is a second layer of topsoil. Now this is just a nice thin layer because I'm just trying to make sure that we broadcast some type of soil over the top of this. One, because I don't want any of this seed to blow away, which can happen if you're in windy areas. But secondly, and much more importantly, is that it protects the seed, especially during the germination process. Mainly because that soil is soaking up that moisture and in turn is keeping our seeds moist during the week-long germination process. With our grass seed fully covered, it's now finally time to bring out the sprinkler and get some water going because we need to be diligent about application of our water since it is the summer months right now. I'd say at least 2 times a day we're gonna have to water this, once in the morning, once at night. If it's a little hot out, a little too hot, we might even have to do a third watering in the middle of the day. But the good news is we are completely done with this project, and this retaining wall video I still need to do, which I'm going to be putting out in another month, and you'll be able to see firsthand how the grass has been keeping up. So if you're not already, make sure you're subscribed so you can see how the grass turns out in a month or so. But till then, thanks for watching, and this is truly one beautiful, sexy beast of a driveway. Oh yeah.